By 1910, Porfirio Diaz had ruled Mexico for 34 years, longer than any other dictator in the country's history, so long that no one imagined the 80-year-old tyrant would fall, plunging the country into chaos. Most Mexicans were terribly poor, and in 1907, bank failures and crop failures pushed the populace to the brink of ruin. They had nothing to fall back on and no political means to secure aid from the state. Driven to desperation, Mexicans were ready to revolt. In 1908, in an interview with James Creelman, an American journalist with Pearson's magazine, Diaz tried to placate his subjects by promising to step down in 1910, no matter what. Diaz acknowledged that Mexico under his administration was not really democratic. He welcomed the establishment of an opposition political party and political challengers to contest elections to succeed him in office. Critical observers later suggested that Diaz had never had any intention of stepping down and that he was only addressing a skeptical American audience. But at the time, Diaz's promise to step down in 1910 was interpreted as a genuine expression of his intentions and sentiments. In 1908, the only serious organized opponents to the Diaz regime were the Magonistas, a ragtag band of anarchists led by the brothers Enrique, Jesus, and Ricardo Flores Magón, who dreamed of turning Mexico into a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary state. They promoted their ideology through their Liberal Party of Mexico, publishing anti-Diaz propaganda in their newspaper, Regeneration. But they never made any substantive progress. They were heavily infiltrated by the Mexican state, which sent agents into the U.S. to spy on them, and when the revolution began, their influence never spread far beyond northwestern Mexico. In the final years of the Diaz regime, it was widely assumed that one of two men would succeed him: Bernardo Reyes, the Minister of War who had support within the military, or José Limantur, the finance minister, who led a faction of technocratic ministers known as the Científicos. This prediction turned out to be totally wrong. After 1911, Reyes and Limantur would never again hold office in Mexico City. Instead, the man who would upset 3 decades of stable rule came completely out of left field. Massive public opposition to Diaz's perpetual rule coalesced around Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner and democratic reformer. He was neither a principled revolutionary nor a subordinate of Diaz. Madero had done well under Diaz. His family was one of the richest in Mexico. But because he had never held office, he had avoided the stigma of formally associating himself with Diaz. He began his career running against Porfirist politicians, denouncing them in various newspapers. He didn't attract national attention until 1909, when he published The Presidential Succession in 1910, making the case for democracy and land redistribution, and he established the Anti-Re-electionist Party, laying the groundwork for a presidential run. When Diaz first came to power back in 1876, he had campaigned on effective suffrage with term limits. Madero now co-opted this mantra, using Diaz's own words against him. The anti-re-electionists nominated Madero to run in the 1910 election to succeed Diaz. 3 days later, Diaz reneged on his promise to step down and announced his 8th bid for the presidency. For the first time since 1876, Diaz had a serious challenge to his rule. Madero traveled from state to state, speaking to tens of thousands of people at each stop. The government would not allow him to disembark, so Madero supporters went to him, flocking to railroad stations across the country. Diaz could read the writing on the wall. 3 weeks before the election, Diaz had Madero arrested and imprisoned in San Luis Potosí, but Madero, out on bail, fled north to the U.S. Diaz was declared the victor with almost 100% of the vote. Madero accused Diaz of fraud, and his supporters refused to accept the results. Throughout Mexico's history, revolutionary leaders have published plans, written declarations announcing a revolution and justifying the insurrection to the public. Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosí from the safety of San Antonio, Texas. In the plan, Madero called on his supporters to rise up in revolt against Diaz on November 20th, 1910. Since Francisco was safe in exile in Texas, Diaz arrested his brother, Gustavo, and charged him with plotting insurrection. Gustavo was then forced into exile as well. The Madero family was a network of more than 1,000 men and women stretched across Mexico and the U.S., but its patriarch, Francisco's grandfather Evaristo, lives in Coahuila. Diaz walked a tightrope, forcing Francisco's closest supporters to leave Mexico in peace, while sending agents to follow them and spy on them. Diaz seized Francisco's land, but left the rest of the Madero family properties alone. Diaz was not ready to take on the entire family, and allowed them to feign loyalty to his regime. Controlling territory on the U.S. border proved to be a huge asset to the Maderos. Diaz's spies lost track of Madero as he passed back and forth across the border. Mexico's economy depended on exports to the U.S., which were sent by railroad through border cities that the Maderos easily infiltrated and later seized outright. Intercepting goods and bombing roads weakened the government. They also imported illicit goods from the U.S. Madero brought in guns, ammunition, men, and cash from New York, Texas, and Missouri. Gustavo spent his time in exile lobbying the U.S. government for recognition of Francisco as the provisional president, while assuring American business interests that they could continue to operate without fear of the revolutionaries. Every president from Madero to Calles sought and bitterly struggled for three things from the U.S. government: diplomatic recognition, economic investment, and non-intervention in Mexican affairs. Madero's day of revolt had mixed results. Federal troops did defect to the revolutionaries and clashed with loyal troops in cities across the country. One city, Gómez Palacio, fell to the revolutionaries when 300 soldiers defected, but Diaz did not fall. The violence convinced Diaz that the gloves had to come off. He realized he was facing an actual revolt, not a flailing protest. He offered $10,000 for Madero, dead or alive, with a strong preference for dead. He threw 9,000 suspected rebels in jail. Finding them wasn't easy. They didn't wear name tags or identifying colors, and typically revealed their defection from the army by shooting at their former comrades. The revolutionaries called themselves Maderistas, and were denounced as insurrectionaries. The troops who stayed loyal to Diaz and his Porfiriato government were the Federales and the Rurales. These two sides formed the first factions of the conflict. This is important for at least two reasons. Keeping track of who was fighting whom gets progressively harder as the revolution descended into a civil war. While these first revolutionaries fought for a set of ideals, they self-identified by their leaders, setting a terrible precedent. Madero's men were Maderistas. Porfirio had his Porfirists. Later revolutionary leaders fought not for democracy or reform, but for power, wealth, and personal advancement. The Maderista rebels were led by Pascual Orozco, Francisco Villa, and Venustiano Carranza in the north. Emiliano Zapata and Ambrosio Figueroa led their own armies in the name of Madero in the south. Diaz had exiled Reyes, his war minister, to France for fear that he would lead his own revolt. So the Porfirists were led by Generals Manuel González Cosio, Juan Navarro, and Antonio Rabago. The Federales resorted to horrifying acts to keep the populace in check. At Gómez Palacio, they forced 50 men, women, and children into a house, set it on fire, and watched them burn to death. At Puebla, the first clash of the revolution occurred 2 days early when federal troops stormed the home of Aquiles Cerdán, killing 150 to 200 revolutionaries, including most of his family. Then they put Cerdán's body on public display. At Cerro Prieto, Federales bayoneted captured rebels and then murdered suspected civilian sympathizers. In May 1911, the Maderistas were on the verge of taking Ciudad Juárez, a huge victory that would have forced U.S. Customs to recognize the provisional government. The U.S. government, which had already stationed 20,000 troops on the border, threatened to intervene militarily. Madero ordered his troops not to attack, as General Navarro moved to negotiate. But Orozco and Villa disregarded his orders and ordered their own troops to lay siege to the city. The breakdown in the chain of command was mutiny, not miscommunication. And this wasn't the first crack in rebel unity. In February, Orozco had been ready to march on Ciudad Juárez, but another general, Lucio Blanco, refused to send his troops into battle alongside Orozco. Blanco's mutiny infuriated Orozco, and it prolonged the revolution by another 6 months. Orozco felt that he had twice been sabotaged by the cowardice of the men around him. The fall of Juárez and Coahuila in Morelos left Diaz in a desperate situation. General Victoriano Huerta still had 400 federal soldiers between Zapata in Morelos and Diaz in Mexico City, but Zapata had more than 4,000 men. Huerta didn't stand a chance. Rather than fighting to the death, Diaz accepted his fate and signed the Treaty of Ciudad Juárez on May 21, 1911. The treaty was not a treaty at all. It was an agreement between Diaz and Madero that outlined a short transition to democracy, with the immediate resignation of Diaz and his vice president, Ramon Corral, in return for their safe passage out of the country. Diaz would be succeeded not by Madero, but by his foreign minister, Francisco León de la Parra, who would serve as interim president until a special presidential election determined a proper successor. José Limantour, who was technically still Mexico's finance minister, not the foreign minister, and Francisco Carvajal, a Supreme Court justice, had negotiated for months with Francisco's father, his cousin José Pino Suárez, and Francisco Vázquez Gómez, a lawyer who had been Madero's vice presidential running mate in the 1910 election. On May 25th, Diaz resigned the presidency. Huerta and a small contingent of troops escorted him and his family to Veracruz. From there, Diaz fled first to Spain and then to France. Bernardo Reyes, no longer an enemy of the state he had ostensibly been protecting, left Paris for Mexico. Reyes had waited for years for Diaz to leave office so he could succeed him. Now that Diaz had fallen, Reyes was ready to lead the new Mexico. He announced his presidential candidacy and began campaigning in Mexico City. Right away there was trouble. A mob of Madero's supporters pelted Reyes with rocks and robbed him. His supporters were attacked and murdered. Unable to campaign, Reyes angrily dropped out of the race. Madero had replaced his running mate, Vázquez Gómez, with his cousin, José Pino Suárez. Vasquez Gomez, abandoned by his ally after he negotiated the peace with Diaz, assumed the mantle of the political opposition upon Reyes' capitulation. Madero defeated Francisco Vasquez Gomez on October 2nd, claiming 95% of the vote. He took office on November 6th.